American Historical and Genealogical Society. Our panel will provide remarks, and we will be happy to take your questions afterwards. This event is being broadcast via Facebook Live on the AAHGS Facebook page. As such, if you can set your phones to silent or vibrate, that would be great. Also, during the question and answer period, we will ask that you identify yourself and your news organization. I'd like to introduce you to our esteemed panel today. Gene Stephenson. He is our AAHGS president. Gene is formerly the Pennsylvania Assistant Deputy State Treasurer and has served on several nonprofit boards over the years. He has served AAHGS in a variety of capacities on both local and national levels. He has also contributed to a variety of historic and genealogy publications. Ric Murphy. Ric is our AAHGS Vice President of History. Ric is an educator, historian, lecturer, and award-winning author. He has served in elected and appointed positions within state and local government, and has taught and lectured at the post-secondary level. He has served on a variety of nonprofit boards. He is also a member of several lineage societies, including the Sons and Daughters of Middle Passage. Dr. Elizabeth Clark Lewis. She is one of the AAHGS founders. Dr. Clark Lewis is a professor of history and public history program director at Howard University. She served as the first AAHGS National Treasurer and Vice President for Genealogical Programs, a graduate of Howard University and University of Maryland. She has served on several national boards of historical organizations and is an award-winning author. We have another panelist that will join us. Her name is Zann Nelson. She's a historian. Ms. Nelson is an historical investigator, writer, and public speaker. An award-winning author, she was director of the Museum of Culpeper History and has served as a full-time volunteer with the National Park Service, including serving 6 years as president of the Civil War Preservation Group. Friends of Wilderness Battlefield, Ms. Nelson also established and implemented the African American Descendants Project for James Madison Montpelier Foundation. I'd like to go ahead and get started with our segments. We are going to have 3 segments today. The first one is AAHGS Origin and Relevance. May of this year marked the 42nd anniversary of AAHGS. In 1977, a small group of historians and genealogists met informally to explore topics of mutual interest. From this group came the development of AAHGS, whose goal would to be foster and encourage historians or historical and genealogical studies of families of all ethnic groups with a special emphasis on Afro-Americans. With the avert of DNA testing and increased interest in connecting with families, AAHGS plays a pivotal role in this quest. Dr. Clark Lewis, would you provide us with some insight in the founding of AAHGS and its relevance in the 21st century?
I think that it was expressed very well by you that there were people who were very interested in African American and genealogical research. I started with the first president, one of the main innovators, James Walker, in a class. And I was doing an enslaved man, his 33 children, and understanding how they were critical to Virginia history. Those of us starting, all of us had various expertise. And we had people who had done extensive genealogical research, who were subject area specialists, like James Walker, and others who had been certified genealogists. That would have been Paul Sluby. So all of us came together with different interests. Initially, we were approached by the National Genealogical Society to become sort of an interest group. And a number of us met, and we decided no, we weren't interested in being a convenient offshoot, that we were bold enough to believe that we could create our own organization. There were a number of naysayers, and we initially thought, well, it would be probably 10, 15 people in the Washington area. And with the advent of Roots and working extensively with Alex Haley, we began to see that there were national implications. And that's when, after 2 casual meetings, we put together the committee to incorporate and to move forward as a national organization. The concern always was to make sure that there was both historical and genealogical information. There were a number of genealogical societies that were interested only in heraldry, but we were always interested in doing what we would now call family history, that we always placed our ancestors within the bigger flow of history and understanding how they had an impact and an effect on history. So it was always a duality, and it served us well over the years. I think when you talk about relevancy, the past is always relevant. It impacts on the future, but very importantly for individuals who are doing family history, you become not only enthralled, but you become engaged in your family's past. You see how it becomes an agent of change, not just for those individuals who lived through it and made your life possible, but you understand how it impacts on the current and future history. So I think that its relevancy is dynamic. It's not static. It's not something that is put in the past or put in a drawer, put in a file. We understand it is being put forth by individuals to make sure that the next level, the next generation, builds upon it. And I think that AAHGS has done that. It has taken the voices and the visions of a small group and given it national and international implications, because in traveling outside of the United States, I invariably came upon people who were very aware of our work all over the diaspora, whether it was in Africa, in the Caribbean especially. There's a very strong interest in what we do, what we say as an organization. So it's a national and an international organization that is dynamic, that is impacting on the diaspora in a way that's very positive. And I'm just glad that I was there those first few meetings. Let me add, I was a baby. It is impactful, and it is insightful, and it is an important impression for now and the future.
Thank you so much for that. Certainly appreciate those comments. Rick, would you like to give some comments on that as well?
Well, you know, I think it's first of all, thank you for the kind introduction. For those of us who come from strong African American families, who've always heard our oral history, it's hard for us to understand how important our ancestors were to us as individuals, but the strong role that they played in American society as a whole. So when I hear Elizabeth talk about how AAHGS started, it started at a time when we as Americans of African descent began to realize the importance of our ancestry. We began to realize that there was a narrative out there that we needed to have in control. And it was important to understand that where we came from helped us where we are today. So I came up during a period of time, much like Elizabeth, as a baby, during the Civil Rights Movement. And it was a period of time where all across America, it was very, very important that we began to realize who we are and what we are. And as young people, black was beautiful. And that was a very unique concept because it meant that it wasn't something that we should be ashamed of. And then when Roots came out, and when we began to realize, as Elizabeth indicated, that Roots was just a TV show, but it showed how important it was that we understood where we came from. We came from kings and queens of Africa. And although we may not have been taught that in the schools, it was important that we begin to understand that in ourselves. So I think AAHGS has been a phenomenal organization. I think it's done an awful lot to help school us in terms of who we are and what we are. And I think some of our elders, and I say that in a respectful manner, our elders who thought of this organization and to bring this organization forward has meant so much to so many of us today. And I think as we look at our legacy going behind us, we'll begin to realize that even our children will benefit from AAHGS.
Thank you, Rick. Certainly appreciate those as well, comments. Jean, would you like to share?
I was not a baby. I'm slightly older or mature, and AAHGS is the voice of our ancestors, and that voice has been ably described by both Elizabeth and Rick, is central to the attempt to correct, as Rick was saying, that false narrative concerning our history, and to recontextualize how important it is for us to be able to blend both the history as well as the genealogy together to have the kind of contextual understanding of our ancestors in the proper way. Our voice has been on the cutting edge of making certain that with the idea of AAHGS being an integral part of how we both connect to our history and genealogy, as well as redefine our history and genealogy. So that's my baby comments.
Well, wonderful. Thank you all so much for those comments. Certainly appreciate it. We'd like to move on to AAHGS and Project 1619. The 2019 commemorates the arrival of the first documented Africans 400 years ago in English-British North America at Port Comfort in Virginia colony. Over the past year, AAHGS has participated in a variety of commemorative events to note this event, as well as historic contributions and achievements of Americans of African descent. Dr. Clark Lewis, can you speak on the significance of 1619?
As a descendant of individuals who were enslaved in Virginia, it resonated especially with me, the idea and the ideals of those first Africans coming into the English colonies. We have to remember that there were over 30,000 Africans who were already in the New World as free and unfree people. And coming into the English colony gave it a very different kind of historical reality. AAHGS was very central to the planning for the committee. I was on one of several committees, and our family Bible is in a very well-received installation or exhibit on 1619 in Virginia's oldest historical society, at the Virginia Historical Society, that family Bible. That family Bible is both a voice and a vehicle, just as AAHGS has been, to telling the story of those who didn't have an opportunity to speak. Their silence still rings true in everything that we did, and that we do today. So we have been actively involved. We've been actively engaged. And we've continued, as I said, to not just be that voice of the past, but we're that important vehicle that has helped move that story forward in a way that enriches, and as it's been received, it enthralls the public, because frequently they're not clear on our history, they're not clear on our contribution. So our voice, AAHGS's voice, gives that clarity and that important, distinctive understanding of the past and how the past has so importantly impacted on our current society today.
Thank you so much for that. Jean,
Yes.
Would you please comment on AAHGS participation with 1619?
Well, 1619, as everyone knows, more recently has gained popularity. Several years ago, we began a discussion about how important it was to embrace 1619 and to give it some definition. And in that process, we came up with the question of, what is your 1619? And what is your 1619 should lead one out of interest to make a determination if they have a 1619. They may not have a 1619 because their ancestry may have, their African ancestry could have been, African American ancestry did not begin until perhaps the beginning of the 1800s or the end of the 1700s. But the critical question is, what is your 1619? And we hope that that question would become the reason why persons would begin to understand 1619 in the context of redefining the African American experience in America. So what we did was we asked our Vice President of History to manage that concept and to give it some definition. And with that, I'd like to ask Rick if he'll continue with that.
Thank you, Dean, for those comments.
1619, I'm originally from Boston, and my knowledge of Virginia history was somewhat limited. My genealogical quest started in the mid to late 1970s. And by accident, I found that I descended from one of the first Angolans who came here in 1619. That was about the extent of my knowledge of it. However, in the past 20, 25, 30 years, I've done extensive research, Virginia history, in the first documented Africans who came here. And I'm oftentimes asked the historical importance of 1619. And that's where our story begins. It's not where it ends, but that's where our story begins. And 1619 begins how we came here as a group of men, women, and children, and we saved a failing colony. The colony was not founded by any government, it was founded by a company. And the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. And when we came here, we brought such significant skills that we helped the tobacco industry, which was the cash crop that saved the colony. And for the past 400 years, while we have come to know the original 20-and-odd Africans, we did not know their names. And there's a reason why we didn't know their names, because if you don't know their names, they're just objects. They're people without voices. They're people without meaning. And as we began to research more and more, we realized, well, we really did know their names because they're in the colonial records. We did know how they went out and bought land and built houses, and how they bought farm animals, how they had the ability to enter into contracts and sell things. And then we began to realize that our narrative was a very different narrative than what we were taught in school. And as a result of that, 1619 opens the door of all of the accomplishments that we as Americans of African descent have made over the past 400 years. When you're a small child in school, the textbooks help us to understand how it is to be ashamed of our enslaved ancestors, but 1619 now gives us the ability to be proud of our enslaved ancestors, because they're the ones that built the country. They're the ones that the economic foundation was founded upon. They're the ones who were the original pioneers. So there's so much stuff that we now have learned as a result of 1619 that while our story starts in 1619, while we commemorated their accomplishments in 2019, that's just the beginning of the story, because now we are in control of our narrative, taking it forward for the next 400 years.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rick, for those comments. Welcome. Zann
Thank you. I
Nelson.
apologize for being late.
No problem. You're right on time, as a matter of fact.
My car is on a tow truck outside.
Okay. All right. Well, we're glad you're here.
Thank you.
We are speaking on the significance of 1619, and take a breath. We would like for you to give some comments on that. Would you please?
I would love to make some comments on that.
Thank you.
Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. I made some notes because I wanted to make sure that I covered the points that I thought were most significant. So if it feels like I'm reading, I apologize to you for that. But there is little dispute that the American story has obfuscated the truth about the way people of color have been treated in this country by denying, burying, and even destroying the facts in favor of speculation. As chair of the Collaboration Committee for AAHGS 1619 Commission, I facilitated 2 roundtable discussions co-hosted by AAHGS and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. The subject was the clarification of the legal status of the first Africans on what would become Virginia soil. Were they enslaved or indentured? There was no shortage of scholars, independent historians, practitioners, and professors. Despite a wealth of documentation that would lead one to conclude that the 20 and odd were bound as indentured servants and not into perpetual enslavement because of their race, a small number of historians left the table holding firmly to their support of the Jamestown Foundation's theory intact. That theory of enslavement was based on a fictional play and speculation. So what is the harm? American citizens and the younger generations are fed an incomplete and inaccurate history, a history that continues to denigrate people of color. But that's not the only harm. This is my American history, and I want to know the whole and complete story. I want my children to know. I want my grandchildren to know. Perhaps then we can begin to eradicate the ongoing legacy of a perpetuated false narrative that poisons the very society we live in and wastes valuable human assets. So why does this happen? Why do people trained in research, either in the field and or academically, why are they continuing this false narrative? Well, I have a theory. My theory is that it is an effort to rationalize a 400-year practice of inhumanity to fellow mankind. We have heard, all of us have heard, that the United States did not capture Africans and bring them to America. That was someone else. Slavery was forced or imposed upon us by others. Enter the 20 and odd Angolans, not our fault. And yet it was, and is. There was no slavery in the English colony of Virginia in 1619. Only an institution of indentured servants. And yes, we, citizens that would become citizens of the United States of America, we established a system of racially based perpetual enslavement beginning in the 1660s. After banning the Atlantic slave trade in 1809 after importation of an estimated 400,000+ Africans, we began a much more aggressive and egregious internal practice, the domestic slave trade. During the height of the selling, exporting, and fracturing of families, an estimated 1.2 million, not 400 plus, 1.2 million during 50 years of captive people, people of color, were uprooted from the Upper South and shipped more than 1,000 miles away into the Deep South, lands of cotton and sugar.
Ms. Nelson.
Yes.
Thank you. I certainly appreciate it. You're leading me into my next segment, and I certainly appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead, and then I'm going to ask for some additional comments on that as well.
All right.
On reclaiming our narrative at historical sites. Over the summer, there has been significant discussion in the media on narratives presented to the public at historic sites nationwide. Some sites are struggling to tell an inclusive narrative, while others are attempting to be inclusive and showcase the role of the enslaved. Some sites have experienced backlash. Now, Ms. Nelson, can you shed some light on that? And I'll ask each one of my panelists to do the same.
So you want to talk about how we can move forward from this, how we can change those false narratives.
Absolutely, and you hit somewhat on some of the things that, if you had to give us just a little more, and then we can move forward.
Okay, and first let me say, I think we are absolutely obligated to do that. I think it is important to listen to the alternative accounts, and they are out there. Previously dismissed as nothing but speculation based on oral history. But there are documented accounts of what was taking place in 1619. What laws were in place, what laws were not in place. And we need to, with honesty and accuracy and a mandate to finally tell the most accurate story that we can, based on the facts.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for
You're
that.
welcome.
Dr. Claude Lewis, can you share how AAHGS can be a positive force in the development of balancing the narratives at historical sites?
I think that AAHGS, again, has already been very much involved. I would like to encourage people to understand that African people had both a cultural continuity and that there were social distinctions that were brought with them. And even by 1630, when Virginia begins to, because of race, make clear distinctions, and we're not talking about when it became a part of people's activities individually, we're talking about it being hardened by law. There are clear indicators that there was a great difference made with people of African descent. But again, that story is not the beginning or the end, just as the arrival of Africans is not their beginning. They came with a cultural continuity that they brought, and there was important social leverages that they used in spite of racism. And that becomes the real important center of what we've been doing. We have helped at cultural sites for them to look at social institutions, cultural legacies, as well as heritage, whether that heritage is within the Eurocentric sense of looking for documents, or whether we see it as Dr. Psyche Williams does with foodways, or whether we see it in family structural activities. There are various ways we can get at the story, and that we can bring both visibility and viability to the richness of the African past, and understand that Africans added a great deal to what we now know as the social fabric of this country. They created those threads that would weave together the African culture and the new culture developed in the New World. And it is that strength And as I said, they become both the voice and the vehicle for creating a new society and an African-centered society that transcends many of the limitations.
Thank you so much for that. Rick, would you like to give some comments on that as well?
AAHGS has made tremendous progress in the endeavor of addressing how the narrative is being communicated nationwide. I think many of you know about the unfortunate incident in which I was involved in at a historical site in Virginia, where someone made the statement that the first Africans who came here were enslaved because their skin was black, which represented dark, dirty, and ugly. Then they went on to say that the English were not enslaved because their skin represented white, beauty, and purity. And then they went on to give an example of 4 African princesses who wanted to be beautiful, so they wanted to move north so they could become white and beautiful. We took a strong stand on that because we felt it was important that we call this out. When this particular incident happened, it took me a long time to respond. 2 seconds. And when I responded, I let them know that their narrative was a false narrative and what was it based on. Our national president took the leadership role and sent a letter, only to be insulted a second time, where we were told that the language came from a 1605 play. So a historical facility is basing their narrative on a 1605 play, a fictitious play. We don't even know if it was a good play or not. We don't even know whether it was condemned or not. But this is the justification for a historical society to perpetuate a narrative. Then to say in the same letter that we know these are horrible words, but get over it, this is how people thought. Now, this took place in May of 2019 on the 400th commemoration of the first documented Angolans who came here. Now, let's put this in perspective. We have textbooks all across the country that talk about how the enslaved were happy to be enslaved and how they were happy to live with their gracious masters. We read those textbooks as children. We now need to take this narrative, and AAHGS has made tremendous progress because when we hear of these stories, we send these letters to let them know that as a historical society and as a genealogical society, we can no longer allow that to happen. We have to take control of our narrative. We have to check them on their narrative. And it's important that our future generations understand that our enslaved ancestors were so critical to the success of this great nation. And all of you have heard me say that I find it appalling that we are condemned when we want to kneel for an American flag, a flag that we fought in every battle since the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War. We have a right to kneel, stand, pray, salute, and even have on our caskets when we come home. This is the America that we built, and this is the narrative that we need to put forward. And I am so proud to be part of an organization that promotes African history, but also promotes our research into our African ancestry. And our ancestors are proud that we have taken this mantle up to change the narrative and to check the narrative.
Thank you. Certainly appreciate those comments. Jean?
I'd echo what's been said.
Absolutely. Well, that concludes our segment, and it is now time for Q&A. So is there any questions that you would have for our panelists?
Hi, I'm Deborah Berry with USA Today.
Yes.
Would you
talked about DNA and the increase in DNA morphism. Can you talk about, with that happening, what does the future look like in terms of family research for African Americans? How much more of an impact will that have, or other tools out there now? Maybe. I think that one of the things, and you said it so very correctly, it's a tool. And it is a tool that is both sensitive to the individual because it looks at your makeup, but it is very supportive of historical research. So I think it's a duality that really is so helpful, that it takes who we are and engages us and directly has us connected to our past in the most sensitive way, because it is literally your biological makeup. It's who you are. But beyond that, and I think that's the key, it takes us beyond just simply who you are in the most, I would say, scholarly way, because it is literally telling a story, and that's all scholars do. In the most scholarly way, it is telling not just you, but those with whom you interact, your real story. And it's telling it in the most viable, and in the way that has the most vitality. Because it doesn't just say, this is who I am just in terms of my physical makeup. It also engages and helps you expand who your family members are and what those family members have continued to contribute. So I think that it is a tool. Those of us doing genealogical research, we know it's not the only tool, but it is a critical tool. And for those who are naysayers, I think what is so very helpful are the stories and the experiences of people who have taken a DNA test and then had that test add so much and so many people to their family and so much to this family lineage that is theirs. And in many ways, they embrace, it enhances the story, but it helps them embrace a whole new group of people in a valid way. So I think that you said it so well, it's a tool. It's not the only tool. Because just as you're made up of these DNA parts, you're still made up of what you give and what your family has given to history. But that is such an important basic tool. And so I'm so glad to see it used and to see people understand its benefits, and although people love to only focus on its problems, that it brings in people that they didn't know, and it can mean other kind of lineage points. That is so minimal. I think it's less than 1% that people have any problems with. But that 99%, the family is extended and made so much more viable. That would be my answer.
In the mid to late 1970s, when Roots came on TV, everybody talked about how powerful those 4 or 5 days were, and everybody in America was glued to their TV at night. And after Roots was over, everyone talked about how powerful television was, how powerful a tool it was to connect America to the African American story. The TV was a critical tool to open up ideas and minds and thoughts. It connected white Americans and black Americans, old Americans and young Americans. It helped families within families talk about a story they never could talk about before. DNA is the next tool, and DNA has been a powerful tool. It has done what Roots did in the 1970s, but then something. DNA has connected the African story. So it's not just an African American story, but even European Americans are finding out that they have African blood in them. So it's now become an American story. Zann talked about the domestic slave trade. We're taught to believe, which it was, the international slave trade, how horrible it was. And it was. But the domestic slave trade was even worse. And we have people who are today finding out through their DNA that their family originally was in Virginia and Maryland, and now they're finding their families in Texas and Arkansas and Mississippi and Alabama. So those families were sold south. So DNA is helping another story open up in terms of how we were treated in this country. DNA is also helping Americans, European Americans, and African Americans to connect to Africa. And you're now finding African Americans who are now finding second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, fifth cousins in Africa. Americans who are now finding out that they came from royal families, that they're finding out through their DNA. So DNA is now a roadmap of who we really are as a people. It's opening up minds and hearts. I attended a conference not too long ago where a white gentleman said that DNA was a very difficult discussion at the Thanksgiving table, because something that they had always believed in as individuals, they now had to look at differently because they too were black. They too have African blood in them. So those conversations and those beliefs that they've had for generation after generation, it's now forcing them to have a new paradigm within the family, because as Elizabeth indicated, this is your family roadmap. This is who you are. You might deny everything else, but you can't deny your DNA. So much like Roots opened up the TV screens, the hearts, the minds, the family discussions in the late 70s, DNA is doing the same thing 400 years after the arrival of the first Africans here in English North America.
If I could, I'd like to piggyback on what both of these speakers have said as to a value of genealogical study and of the DNA, is that it may seem obvious, but it begins to flesh out a more truthful narrative about the African American history here. And when we do that, we need to take it one step further, and this gets into the collaborative efforts. We need to have more of the kind of roundtable forums that we had last year. We need to work with the school systems to change what they are teaching in the classroom, both what they are leaving out and what they are teaching incorrectly. And we need to do some teacher workshops that then get to the children and encourage those children to ask questions. When they go to Jamestown, or they go here, or they go there, and they hear a narrative, ask the question, what is your source? So I think we take all this genealogical work and this historical work and the DNA, and we move it. We use those tools to expand what we're actually collaborating with others on, particularly in the classroom.
And I want to add something else. When I was a kid, my grandmother told all of us not to throw a stone at another kid in the schoolyard. And her rationalization was, they could be your cousin. DNA has now shown us how true that is. And DNA has also shown us, as a historian, I understand that the indigenous people of North America are who we now refer to as Native Americans. But we as African Americans are now the second indigenous people, because our ancestors go back 15, 20, some instances 25 generations. We are now the second indigenous people of this country. So our DNA tells us that when someone tells us to go back, we're going back to Virginia, North Carolina, because we were the original pioneers that opened up those great vast lands of timber. So DNA really has changed the national narrative for us. So when I hear someone say go back, I really wonder if they're referring to themselves or us, because we are the second indigenous people of this country.
Thank you.
I'm Floyd Johnson from Mitchell Baptist Chapel. I find when in talking with other people about odds and genealogy, they get very excited. I have a problem. I don't know exactly where to send them. I know we'll have a chapter, but do we have any kind of publicity material or anything that I can give out to people? That's one of my main reasons for coming here to this meeting. I want to find materials to take back to people who really are interested in doing genealogy and historical research. These are just people, ordinary people in the community, but they're very excited about the work. So, if I could get the information to them, it would expand our ranks. We have a lot of people on the ground who are willing to do research, or willing to do projects, or willing to do other things that would help this organization. I'm a retired principal, so I know exactly what she's talking about, the classroom. Because it can't start with the teachers. It has to start in the universities. It has to start in the government.
Yeah.
And we don't have that kind of government that's going to do that now. But we need to have some government that's going to help put the right teaching in the schools. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and you know exactly what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Guess what? We didn't. I grew up there. We never heard about the riots. We never heard anything in the classroom. But our teachers were quite militant and teaching us how to deal with the system, as they say. But I'm an adult now, I can understand why they didn't teach it or couldn't teach it. They would lose their jobs. But I learned about the riots in New York when I went to school up there. I was shocked. I said, wait a minute. This is where I grew up. I never heard of this before. Why? It could not be taught in the schools. It could not be taught in the universities. So we children had to get it secondhand. But we did know about all those people on that ballot.
In reference to your question about how to get the outreach, the material, Jean, can you? Okay. Rick, okay.
I'm sorry, what was your first name?
Floyd.
Floyd. For the past 3.5 years as an organization, we have done an awful lot to promote 1619. We are so happy and pleased that the mass media has picked this up. We are so happy that, much like you indicated, sometimes it's difficult for a local community to talk about what took place in that community for a whole host of reasons. But when I look at what the New York Times has done and how they're going to talk the totality about 1619, and Floyd, I don't want you to tell anybody, but tomorrow I'm going to show something that USA Today did that's mind-boggling, that you're going to be able to take back on your cell phone. And I don't think we would be able to give you all of what you want, but I think the mass media is now coming to the realization of how important this narrative is. And you will have a wealth of material because the newspapers, everybody now understands that the time has come to correct this false narrative. I think the USA Today has done I was given something a couple of weeks ago and I had to apologize because traveling on the country, I just didn't get a chance to look at it. And I didn't look at it until Monday. And I was shocked. So I think you're going to start to see a whole lot of material coming forward. And I know that our president is putting stuff out there. Our public relations team is putting stuff out there. But we can't reach out to everybody like the mass media can.
That's not my question, though. I understand that about 1619. I'm talking about the information about this organization, AAHGS.
Okay.
Something that's put together that I can give people who ask questions. I can answer so much, but I learned something today about 1977. I didn't know it was that young, the organization. So that helps me. I have to have something that I can talk to people and leave something with them so that they know where to go and join and where to research. But our chapter can help with the research and stuff like that. We have people there who already know that can help people who want to know how to get started. So that's what I'm really looking for. 1619, I agree. There are a lot of articles and things on the computer that I picked up just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I know that it's coming. But where to send people to really get to their work about their family is that I'm lacking with some for materials. That's what I like. And as far as schools, I don't know.
I'd just like to add one of the things I think that helped me understand how both progressive and perceptive our organization was from the beginning. The first published and public material that we distributed was a small one-page fold-over on doing family history. And other national organizations sort of laughed at us, like, why in the world are you wasting the very first publications? And we handed it out literally like tracts to everyone with whom we could speak. So our organization, from its inception, in the most perceptive and progressive way, was focused on, much like Carter Woodson, getting that story out to everyday people.
Right.
I know electronically now the website does it. And because people don't handle paper like they have done in the past. So I think AAHGS has stayed, as I said, in that future vein, as that voice and vehicle. And the vehicle is going to go down many roads. But I can say, as a founder, we were laughed at because the first money we took, we did an extensive number of publications that simply said, as African Americans, these are the steps that you use. And one of the things, as was said very well, was a number of us had worked with the Kunta Kinte Society in the early 70s, when everyone remembers when Mr. Haley made it and was famous. But there were a whole lot of people who were on the ground who gave him support and undergirded his research before it was picked up by the major media, because it was believed it was a story that wasn't going anywhere. It didn't have any traction. So a number of us put our wheels right behind him and his belief systems. And so the Kunta Kinte Society worked tirelessly in those early years to help push that story. And so a number of us brought that same vitality to AAHGS, and that this is the story. And if you look at the, and I'm not sure what made it to the Hollywood when it came out on television, but in every one of his speeches, I heard Mr. Haley speak at the Smithsonian, the White House, everywhere. He thanked those members of AAHGS, and when we became an organization, he gave us extensive publicity wherever he spoke. He talked about AAHGS and the people early on. So I think that what we're saying is that this is an organization in the most progressive and, to me, perceptive way, understands that this is a story that everybody can relate to.
Yes, but do you have those tracks available? Are they somewhere online or something like that?
I think the website, I would always encourage you to ask people to use the website and to speak with any, I know the officers always have it, that there are small, easily read, we don't need to make it hard, easily read basic information, data that is available, and we'll make sure that it gets to you.
Okay.
And that its use will be extensive. And we're glad that there are people who are still out there, as we say, on those front lines, giving the information out and taking in our members.
Well,
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. But it's also on the website, and I'll be happy to share with you after the segment. All right.
Deborah's got another question.
Oh, Deborah, come on.
Even with more access to records and the DNA and all of that, how challenging has it been, or is it still, to change the narrative of African Americans in this country?
Asking me? Oh,
Across. Go ahead.
The narrative has been embedded for 400 years. It's embedded in textbooks. It's embedded in products that we buy. It's embedded into the subconsciousness of everything and everywhere we go. I made that statement a couple of months ago, and someone challenged me on that statement. And I think they were surprised as to my response to that challenge. And we now live in a technological age of robots and computers. And if you notice that the smartest robots today are white. And the robots that do routine functions are black. So that just shows you how the consciousness, the psyche of who we are as a people, either within these United States or around the world, that to change the narrative, it's not going to be easy. To change the narrative, we have to challenge it every time something comes up. To change the narrative, we have to encourage those who are the change agents. And those that want to hold on, like Zann indicated, we now have to challenge them. What's your documentation? What are you basing this on? Those of us who are scholars, we need to hit it head on. We need not to run away from it. Some of us will take knocks, but there's a greater purpose here. And in answering that question, I have to look at that T-shirt right there. I am the voice of my ancestors. And that's important because we now need to wear it, we need to engage it. So it's not easy. It's not going to be easy. And those of you who have to confront with the boardroom, sometimes you can't make money on this stuff. So I know when the media wants to write a story and they get to go to their editors and their editor's boss and the shareholders, you know, it doesn't ring and bring all that money that you want forward. When we have conferences and we tell these big corporations we want you to come, and they want to know, well, how many people you're going to have there, how much money am I going to make? You got to say to them, this isn't about people and money, it's about changing a narrative. So it's not easy.
I'd like to add that you have the reality that there's a reciprocal support network that can be created. Take a company like Wells Fargo that absorbed some smaller banks that had a less than favorable history. It's AAHGS and other organizations that can go to them and show them how, in the most reciprocal way, you can retell that story. You can make it an inclusive story as opposed to a story that is not necessarily negative. You can show progress, and I'll use myself. If I'm the descendant of an enslaved man who was fathered by his owner and his 33 children, there's a vitality and a vibrance in that story. It is not a story of voiceless victims. It's individuals who, in spite of the valley, found victories. And that's the way you help people reframe and retell history. I also think that there are clear examples of how there can be change. There was a time that individuals routinely on businesses would have a sign that would say, no Jews, or that there were these anti-Semitic beliefs. Because of the aggressive stand of individuals within that community, you wouldn't dare make a statement like that. And you wouldn't dare even think that kind of an anti-Semitic thought. And I would like to applaud our president. I've heard him speak individually, and someone asked him about his name, Baba, as he introduces himself, Baba Gene Stephenson. And he makes it very clear where the name comes from and the designation. And one person had the audacity, I'll say, to indicate to him, well, that's a term of endearment in Africa. Because he explains it very well, very correctly, very clearly and succinctly. But he makes it clear that that term is a cultural term that didn't just come from Africa. It was brought by African people and used by enslaved Africans and embraced by individuals such as him. These kinds of conversations help make wider populations, and this was a very integrated audience. Everyone went away from there understanding why this man's leadership of this organization and that title are important. And at every turn, we connected, not in a way that's difficult or abrasive, but that there's a reciprocal support network. The people of African descent, no matter what the situation is, we can bring that kind of positive history to it, not just to the history, but also to our culture, our ancestors, and our legacy. And I think that's what this organization stands for. It stands for constantly bringing a newness to history and helping it being renewed and reframed through family.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. On behalf of AAHGS, I'd like to thank USA Today for being here, Deborah Berry. And also I'd like to thank our panelists for being so wonderful with your comments that you shared with us. We've learned, I like to say, a lot from this, so the takeaway is very appreciative. Ms. Nelson, Ric Murphy, Baba Jean, Stephenson, and Dr. Clark. Certainly appreciate you all for being here, and thank every one of you for joining us today.
I'd also like to take the time to compliment the person who has led this discussion. You've done a formidable job keeping us on time, on task. So we thank you again.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure.
Fantastic.
Okay.